Well, Charles, as we continue to refine the format for closing in, we're differentiating it from not being Sunday with Charles on Wednesday to our new interview format, and we are delighted to be joined today by Patti Stockman. Hello, Patti, how are you?
I'm doing great, as well as can be expected.
Yeah,
and it's a real honor to have you on air with us, Patti, and for the viewers, Patti is a distinguished activist, and I guess you work at NASA as well, but she's also the wife of Steve Stockman, who is in prison for alleged charity fraud crimes that we're going to discuss and the way he was targeted in the context. But I saw Patti's recent piece in the American Thinker, and I reached out to Thomas Lifson, who runs it, and I said, could we please get Patti on our show so she can tell her story to our audience? Yeah. So you're coming to us, I think, from Texas.
I am, Houston area.
And this article caught my eye here, how the DOJ targeted other conservatives. Why don't you take us back a little bit to how what Steve was up to when he was in Congress, how he fell afoul of Lois Lerner and the people who were backing Lois Lerner, and then what happened next.
Okay, well, my husband served in Congress twice, once in the mid-90s and again came to Congress in 2013. And so in the 90s, he was involved in the Whitewater Committee and was just constantly battling the Clinton agenda. This time when he went back to Congress, he was constantly exposing corruption in the Obama administration and battling their agenda, and oftentimes actually stopping the agenda on some fronts. So he was just a constant thorn in the side. In fact, one I think it may have been Politico or maybe it was The Hill. One publication, perhaps The Hill, labeled him Obama's chief needler after just a month in office in 2013.
That's very good.
So,
if you would, you mentioned Whitewater, and that's very interesting. What was he focusing in on Whitewater?
Oh, he was on the banking committee that looked into Whitewater. There was a Whitewater subcommittee that he was involved in. And I remember him telling me one weekend when he came home, man, Patti, when the public finds out about this, there are going to be some major shakeups. Well, as you know, part of the public heard about it, but he was really stymied by the fact that nothing came of it. So that was really an eye-opener for us. And of course, we saw a lot of that with the Clintons, how the press, as we see even currently, they turn a blind eye and things just aren't elevated. The public is not aware of the corruption on the Democrat side of the aisle. In fact, Steve calls it, they have Democrat privilege cards.
Yeah, well,
ones that skate.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. As Jason and our viewers know, I have taken, during this pandemic period of lockdown here in New York City, I've been able to go back into my vast array of books and resources and go back over my notes. And one of the particular things I was focusing upon is Whitewater. I don't think the true Whitewater story has ever been told. The true Whitewater story was banks, tiny banks in Arkansas, making large loans relative to their capitalization to these crooked projects to take inaccessible land in remote portions of Arkansas and market to unsophisticated out-of-staters in Illinois, in Missouri, in Michigan, the idea that you could, for a small amount of money, get a dream lot overlooking a river somewhere in Arkansas. The only problem being there were no roads, no septic, no electricity, no nothing, no telephone, and it had been clear-cut, the land. So it was not like you'd really want to put a house there in any event. And they sold these properties not using mortgages and for cash, but for installment purchase contracts, which are not allowed, I don't think, in Texas. I was talking to a friend of mine in Texas. These are contracts where unsophisticated buyers sign up to buy stuff over, let's say, 5 years, and if you miss one payment, you lose everything. So they were selling these lots again and again, not recording them, because under Arkansas law, you don't have to record them, and then using the money that they swindled to pay for political campaigns, to finance the lifestyles of the Clintons and the other crooks around the Clintons. And this began in 1977 when Jim McDougal was nobody, right? And the real story, as much as I admire what your husband did, I think that the folks in Congress were misdirected away from, Whitewater was a small piece, 230 acres out of 3,200 acres, where they were doing the same thing on a grander scale. And that story needs to get told. It is that story that the Clintons, and with Madison Guarantee, that the Clintons have been trying to cover up ever since 1977, when Hillary Clinton got a job at the Rose Law Firm that she should never have gotten, and 79 when she was promoted to partner, when she should never have been promoted based on her record to partner. It's a terrible story, and I go on to set the stage for you, because the crimes that the Clintons are committing and the Obama administration was trying to cover up, and the holdovers are trying to cover up, are 3,000 times, maybe 100,000 times worse than what the charges that were levied against your husband.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And I don't know if he gained any insight into that or not. Financial and anything with numbers is not my forte, and I don't hang on to it. Besides, he didn't go into the findings with me personally, so I can't speak to that, but I'm not at all surprised to hear that. In fact, just within the past few days, and I was trying to think as you were talking about that, who it is, but someone just recently told me, yeah, I was in Arkansas, or I am from Arkansas, and the Clintons sold a great deal of our property. They just sold it away, and that must be what he's talking about.
Yeah, there's a series of land deals that they did, and I did them legitimately on a smaller scale, personally, just for a side hobby when I was younger. And you could do it correctly. I mean, you get a real engineer, you get a real architect, you don't pay bribes, you get laws passed, you do what you need to do, and you take undeveloped land and you turn it into land that people want to use, and then you sell it at a higher price because you've done something legitimate. You don't say, well, the International Paper Company, which is a gigantic landowner in Arkansas, wants to clear-cut land, and they don't want the environmental people to do anything about it. When you clear-cut forest land, if it's hilly, the topsoil goes into the river. And at the same time they wanted to do that, the Tyson Poultry Company, they wanted to do what chicken farmers do when they're not regulated. And then the Stevens people wanted to get involved with the banks, profiting from all these bank deals. And 2, 3, 4, 5 families had the Clintons bought and sold from 1977 forward. He goes in as Attorney General. He's making $26,000 a year in 1977. I mean, that wasn't a lot of money back then. And suddenly the Attorney General has a wife who doesn't have a job. She gets a job. They're easily bought off. Then they're bought off as governor, bought off, a long stretch as governor, bought off as president. They're bankable.
And they never changed their colors. In fact, Hillary Clinton is one of the people that my husband exposed. He wrote a letter to the Treasury Department bringing to light the fact that there had been allowed sale of dual-use steel, that is steel that's used in nuclear centrifuges, to be sold by a Ukrainian-owned American company to Iran. Yeah. And Steve was the one that broke that. In fact, it was covered by Newsweek back in the early days of Hillary's presidential campaign. And Steve really feels strongly, I think he was maybe told that was as a inoculation for her against that coming up in the campaign. She could say, "Oh, that's old news. That was covered a long time ago." But in fact, the Ukrainian oligarch who owned the company is
Victor Pinchuk.
Pinchuk, yeah. And Newsweek had reported that he was the top donor to the Clinton Foundation. I don't know if it was you, Jason, or someone else. Maybe it was you in an email to me, Charles, saying that in fact he wasn't the largest donor, but he certainly was one of the biggest donors to the Clinton Foundation. And Steve unmasked that. You know what? I just realized my battery's about to die on my computer. I need to pull a cord over here real quick
Please do.
and plug in.
Please do.
Talk amongst yourselves for a second.
I will. So, Jason, what Patty's talking about there with Victor Pinchuk, our viewers know a lot about Victor Pinchuk because we talked about him in the past. And I'm so glad that she was able. I hope she gets a computer powered up.
Well, but it's interesting. He's in there. Whitewater, Uranium One, and now he's in jail. Yeah. Interesting.
Isn't that's funny how that works. And interesting that this is happening in Texas. I mean, Texas is still a red state, but I think Houston, or as they like to say in New York, Houston, is a place that I think has a hard left mayor, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And, you know, it's... Am I right about that, Patty, that Houston has a hard left?
We've had really liberal mayors for quite a while, and the current mayor is maybe a little less hard left than the previous one, but he's definitely a lefty.
Well, let me just connect some dots for you on the context here, because I think you'll find it interesting. And should you speak to your husband, I believe about this. I mean, I believe that I may know quite a bit of interest to him on the context of why people would be out to try to target him. So Pinchuk is an Ukrainian oligarch who is married to the daughter of one of the former strongman leaders of Ukraine. And he is cited through the so-called Victor Pinchuk Foundation as being a donor to the Clinton Foundation of, I think, 10 million plus, and his wife, Elena Franchuk, is also, she has another AIDS charity that also, I think, gave 5 to 10 million. Then in addition to those contributions to the foundation itself, there's this thing that's no longer in existence called the Clinton Global Initiative, which I think was just a confederation of con artists that would meet in New York City around the time of the UN General Assembly in September of every year from 2005 to 2016 or thereabouts. And you would go into a room, the Clintons controlled the entrance, who got in and who doesn't get in. All the journalists were eager to get into the room to hobnob with all these famous people, leaders, presidents, billionaires, whatever. And they would get up on stage and they would announce their charitable intentions. They called them commitments to action, which in charity, a commitment to action is, I don't want to curse, but let's just say the letters are B and S. A commitment to action is nothing. It's not even a pledge. You know, real people who give money away to charity don't want their names out there, and they give a check or they wire money. They don't say, I might get around to making a pledge that might, you know, put me up on stage and pat me on the back. Anyway, Pinchuk began getting involved with the Clinton Foundation in 2004. And at a time when the Clinton Foundation had never been audited, though it started in 1997, it had never been lawfully organized, never operated, never cleared to do anything outside of Little Rock. But by 2004, they had been doing stuff fighting HIV and AIDS internationally. And Pinchuk and his wife started working on that project together with this non-existent charity in which Bill was involved in 2004. And the dimensions of what we're talking about, the charges against your husband, according to the indictment, are $1 million of problems. We're talking here about billions of dollars.
That's right.
Of problems.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Steve is, I mean, there were 4 donations totaling $915,000. And when the time came to sentence, the prosecutors threw in some earlier donations that weren't even part of the case that they brought to bump it over $1 million to increase the length of Steve's sentence. What happened to him was he was just targeted, just like we've seen done with the men around President Trump. It's the same tactic as I've watched all of their prosecutions or the pursuit of them unfold, and even the impeachment of the president himself. At one point, I just had to turn off Fox News and stop watching those impeachment hearings because they were so identical to the proceedings against my husband in court. And by the way, I know General Flynn is broke because of that. Well, so are we. We spent all of our disposable income or disposable resources and all of Steve's retirement before he was even indicted. And we can go into more what he was doing that they would want to get him the heck out of the way. But And now they are. So I spent a great deal of portion of my retirement for his defense, which turned out to really be no defense in a trial. And now they're garnishing my salary, my take-home salary, to help pay for the fine levied against him. It's just outrageous, the out of controlness of our government. And if people want to help with our Steve's legal defense, they can go to our website, defendapatriot.com, or text FIGHT to 444-999. Because our government just cripples patriots like my husband.
Well, talk to us a little bit. This charity that was the target of the prosecution, was it a Texas charity?
No, not Texas. No, not Texas charities. And in fact, there were several charities at play with which my husband was associated in one way or another, and they were educational primarily in nature. They were one was educating voters and educating young people in how the Hill works. It was to help train interns. And in fact, they were going to try to purchase a house on the Hill, Capitol Hill, to house a few interns, but also serve as a training facility for them, just kind of a meeting and training facility. Much of the case turned on that piece of the proposal. Just that was one item in this very large proposal for which they did not raise all the funds for the proposed amount. And so they were not able to even make a down payment on a home on Capitol Hill to do this. And the prosecution made the whole trial in terms of that nonprofit about the house that was never purchased, even though many of the other goals and objectives laid out in the proposal were addressed. I mean, that the activity was all the activity for these nonprofits was fully in line with what the proposals had said. They weren't fully funded. And so as anybody that's associated with a nonprofit knows, you don't accomplish with a few donations everything in a proposal. But so basically, the way my husband's conviction came down, it sets new precedent for nonprofits to be, and there's some articles out there about that, nonprofits better be worried. It's written by Rachel Alexander, and she talked about how all nonprofits should be concerned, because if you don't finish what you propose, you can now be guilty of fraudulent solicitation. So the whole thing, there were all kinds of stacked charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, on each donation. 4 donations, and each check carried a series of fraud charges because the prosecution claimed that my husband fraudulently solicited these funds, but they never ever presented any evidence or testimony that he intended to defraud at the time of solicitation. So the whole thing is just really extraordinarily shady. He's not guilty of what he's charged with, and there he sits 2 years into a 10-year sentence.
Now, who was representing him in the defense?
We had local Houston attorneys. Actually, by the time he was even indicted, as I said, we had spent all of our disposable income and all of his retirement, so we were basically broke. And so he asked for a court-appointed attorney at that point. We couldn't afford good counsel like Sidney Powell. So he started off with a court-appointed attorney because he qualified for it. And that was in the spring of 2017. By the end of the summer, that attorney had not delved into the material at hand, nor sat down and grilled Steve on, what's the truth here. In fact, attorneys the attorneys that we've encountered seem to just treat the client like a statue to set on the shelf while they go try to figure out how they're going to defend them. It was just outrageous. So I won't even bring up their names, but they didn't understand the laws at play, nonprofit laws, nor campaign finance laws. They didn't have a handle on those, and as I said, they didn't. Not only did they not ask Steve about it, but they didn't really listen to him when he tried to explain to them what the law says and what was done and why everything was legal. But they didn't delve into it. And so he really would have done a better job defending himself if he knew the legal ins and outs of.
Well, Patti, I'm so sorry we lost you there for a second. We're going to bring you back.
Not only did they not ask Steve about it, but they didn't really listen to him when he tried to explain to them what the law says and what was done and why everything was legal, but they didn't delve into it. And so he really would have done a better job defending himself if he knew the legal ins and outs of.
Oh, Patti, I'm so sorry we lost you there for a second. There's a bit of a technical problem. I don't know if you can hear us right now, Patti. Hang on just a second. Have you still got us? Why do we not have sound here? Sorry, stand by, Patti. So frustrating how this is happening.
Did it just cut out on her?
It's this is a problem with Skype that I've been working to resolve. But okay, Patti, I think you should be able to hear us, right?
I can hear you.
Okay, so Charles, you can carry on and get this reset, and we'll be back to our.
Sure, Patti. Just as a point of interest, this was in federal court, this case, in Texas, is that right?
That's right, in Houston.
And who was the lead prosecutor in the case? Was it an Obama holdover?
No, there were young folks. They weren't high up in the Justice Department, and you know, honestly, I can't even though I know their names, they're not coming to me.
Sure.
So I can't even tell. They're no one you would know.
Uh-huh. Because, you see, at this time, you say the indictment was in March of 2017?
Right. And the trial was in the spring of 2018. And he went to prison 2 years ago, this past Easter Sunday.
My God.
As soon as the guilty verdict came in, the prosecution had asked the judge to immediately remand him to prison, and he wasn't sentenced for 7 months. He sat in prison for 7 months before the judge even sentenced him.
Mm-hmm.
And Sidney Powell was so incensed because she and Steve knew one another and frequently had exchanges on current legal things going on. And she was so incensed by the fact that the way Steve was treated and the fact that he was immediately put in prison that she signed on pro bono, took the motion that Steve's attorneys drafted calling for his release pending sentencing. Sidney took it, put some teeth into it, put her name on top of theirs, and called for a hearing for his release and filed it with the court. And the judge denied the hearing and dismissed the motion completely. And Sidney Powell was just beside herself.
See, I think that it's very important to go back over this ground because I'm quite familiar with the Clinton Foundation and the Obama Foundation and the abuse of dynastic political families, of charities in their name, to fund lifestyles, to fund political campaigns, to serve as a vehicle for foreign governments and big corporations to purchase influence and get things out of the unregulated globalist system in which these politicians are so well connected, whether they're in office or out of office. And at this time, what had happened was Corinne Brown, you probably know her case, that's an African-American woman who went away, a congressperson.
Oh, she's a congresswoman that she was just released because of the coronavirus.
Right. So you'll release her.
Trying to get Steve out.
Yeah, you'll release her. She was put away, I think, for 5 years. The accusation in her case was $700,000 or $800,000, I think. In her case, my reading of what I see is she's guilty as hell in her case. Your case, not so clear. And I think what was going on, as a guess, in the holdovers, in the Obama holdovers at the senior level of the Justice Department, at the senior level of the FBI, they knew that a bunch of us were going after the Clintons and going after the Obamas, and they needed to have the narrative to say, you know, look, this happens, it's common, you know, it's Democrats, it's Republicans, why are you making such a big deal about the Clinton Foundation, the Clintons? Everyone studied the Clintons forever. You can't go against Barack Obama. You can't ask questions about his presidential foundation. And so I think, unfortunately for your husband and for you and your family, this was a convenient prosecution that served political purposes. And just as we're now, while we were preparing to go on air together, there's just been news about who was involved unmasking Flynn and others, and it was none other than Joe Biden, and likely Barack Obama, and the whole crew at the top. So that crooked crew that is leading the Obama and his Alumni Association, they knew, and the Clintons knew, that the Clintons and the Obamas had massive exposure if anybody serious started taking a look at their foundation. So they needed to have, unfortunately, your husband in the crosshairs. And I think it's really important that now that Sydney has got some more free time, and now that she's perhaps one of the most famous lawyers in the world, I hope she'll get back and get re-engaged in this effort with you.
Well, I mean, we were really blessed that she had done that, and she has peripherally been there for Steve and for me, and done a few things here and there. But she told Steve early on, I think he wanted her to take his sentencing, or he was trying to pull her in, and she said, "Steve, you can't afford me." And so that's the thing, we can't afford her. But yet, if she would mention Steve's case a couple of times on the Rush Limbaugh show or Hannity's show, American public is not aware of Steve's case. And if they were, I think we could have the funds necessary to hire Sydney, or certainly someone who's more of a fighter than what we've had so far. We've got a very knowledgeable, Steve's got a very knowledgeable appellate attorney, but he's not a pit bull like Sydney. The thing is, I think you're absolutely right, and it's not just, he was a convenient example with nonprofits, but there's a lot more too, because after Steve had been in office in 2013 for 2 weeks, he did a press release, because it was right in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook catastrophe, and he did a press release saying basically that if the president oversteps his authority and limiting the Second Amendment rights, my husband Steve Stockman would exercise every arrow in his quiver, including restraining funding and doing this and doing that, or if need be, seeking articles of impeachment. But boom, the headlines the next day were Texas congressman threatens impeachment. So it was huge news, right out of the chute, that Congressman Stockman's threatening impeachment. And he was on Fox News at least once that I know to talk about that. Then another couple of weeks or so was the State of the Union address, and I had no desire to go to Washington and listen to President Obama at the State of the Union address. So Steve had a guest pass, and he invited Ted Nugent, who is, as your audience would know, is on the NRA board of directors, and he did a press release that he had invited Ted as his guest. So all day, the day of the State of the Union address, press was constantly filing through my husband's office to talk with Ted Nugent about Second Amendment limitations in the wake of Sandy Hook and all of that. So he'd already stolen a lot of the president's thunder, because Steve knew that he was going to be using the State of the Union as a prime platform for limiting Second Amendment. So Ted was in the audience, and afterwards I had press all around him. So boom, second shot, second poke in the eye, I guess you'd want to say, of the president. And then Steve also later, he was first to expose by preempting it, saying, understand the president is planning to pay ransom to the terrorist network, Haqqani terrorist, a ransom for Trader Bo Bird Dog. And so he broke that news. And he also blocked legislation, key legislation of the president's that was supposed to come from the Senate, one on immigration and one was gun control legislation. And Steve had a really seasoned staff of employees, And in fact, they had the oldest average age of staffers in my husband's office because he got seasoned people. And they dug back and they realized that there's a little known procedure that can be used in the House called blue slipping. The Senate, by law, is not allowed to levy taxes, much like the health care bill did, right? And both of these carried what, in essence, were taxes. So Steve used this process called blue slipping that prevented each one of those pieces of legislation from ever making it to the House. Big bruises for the Obama administration. Then he signed on to a resolution to impeach Eric Holder for his participation in Fast and Furious gun running, where we lost a border control agent through the hands of those guns that the Obama administration allowed to be trafficked. But the thing that you brought up was with Lois Lerner. You got crosswise with Lois Lerner because, as many in your audience will probably remember, her nonprofit division, Lois Lerner and her nonprofit division of the IRS, partnered with the DOJ to harass conservative and Christian nonprofit organizations, Tea Party and others. True the Vote was one of the key nonprofits that they went after. And so Congress was trying to expose that and get to the bottom of it, and Lerner was blocking their every move and was found in contempt of Congress. So Steve filed a resolution. Again, his staff went back in history and saw that in the past, Congress has actually arrested people who are charged with contempt of Congress. And Steve said, Congress looks inept if we don't do anything. I'm filing this resolution to call for her arrest, lock her up until she complies with congressional requests. Boom, he's back in the news. I mean, everything, all of these things he did, he was constantly in the news nationally and on talk show hosts across the nation. Congressman Steve Stockman was a popular guest on all talk shows. One of his staffers told me about a year or so ago, he said, Patty, other congressmen's staffs, they were like pleading for some opportunity to have a press appearance, but we were having to turn the press away. So he was constantly out there. So that just tells you how visible he was with exposing these corruptions and calling an ace and a spade, and they had to shut him up. So guess who came after him in this conviction? It was a partnership of a DOJ Public Integrity Unit and Lerner's former IRS nonprofit division. And so the whole prosecution turns on nonprofits, and it's the same partnership that went after all those conservative nonprofits. Hello?
Yeah.
I don't know why people can't connect the dots.
Right. When you think about it, I remember when I got into this whole business of doing podcasting and journalism by accident, and I got into the focus on the Clinton Foundation by accident because Jerry Corsi was a friend of mine, and he said,
friend of ours.
And he said at one point, what do you make of this Clinton Foundation? So I started looking at it in around February of 2015. So Lois Lerner has a diabolical past. I mean, she when she was a lawyer at the Federal Election Commission, she tortured political opponents, including the fellow out in Nevada.
Including Steve Stockman. They go back that far.
Yeah. And when you think about the charity world, the overwhelming majority of people who get involved in charity are honest. And the reason there aren't a lot of prosecutions like this, in part, in recent years, is because the IRS divisions overseeing this have become corrupted. But another reason is that people who really want to devote their lives to charity are trying to pursue good works. They're fundamentally honest people. Right?
That's right.
And this territory is a territory that has not been brought into the modern era. The regulations that apply to charities were drafted in 1969, and they need to be updated. And they never contemplated these two-career political dynastic couples that would need a lot of money because they weren't rich for their political campaigns and would set up multiple charities with crooked or non-existent accountants. And they'd find donors who really wanted to get through the $2,300 per person political contribution max to send money into a charity, And they would say they sent, let's say, 100,000 to the charity. The charity would give them a piece of paper saying, yeah, we got your 100,000, but they would only send 10,000. And so as a way, when you have the charity division of the IRS corrupted and you have the main auditing part corrupted, you can unleash the power of the IRS to torture your husband, your family, you, and you increase the power and the value of politicians, right? They can go in, and if they're dishonest and they're not serving their interests of we the people and respecting the Constitution, they can do what Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton did. They can do what Barack Obama did and say, look, forget the Constitution. That's so old school. What we're going to do here is I'm going to be the President of the United States. I'm Barack Obama. I decide what the Constitution means, and I'm going to train the resources of this government against my political enemies. I'm going to put Steve Stockman in prison, and I'm going to reward Eric Holder and my wingman. And this example, your husband and you are suffering, this example that has been out there now for 8 years, that accelerated, frankly, just at the time that your husband came to Congress, Hillary Clinton and her staff walked out the front door of the State Department and retained custody and control of government records, extremely valuable government records, the contact information for all the wealthy people around the world, all the leaders around the world. She retained all of those presidential and public records in her custody and control until she reluctantly turned it in December of 2014. She stole. Every thief who gets caught says, well, you know, I'll give the money back. No, you're a thief. She stole these records on a gargantuan, multi-billion, when you consider all these projects beyond the Clinton Foundation, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. She has 3 homes, right? She had no money when they started in life. Today they have hundreds of millions, maybe more. They're right. Free. They're enjoying Mother's Day. I don't think they care about Easter particularly, but they were enjoying Mother's Day. They may enjoy Father's Day. Let's hope they never enjoy Take Your Daughter to Work Day at the White House. But they're out there having profited from this. Lois Lerner got to say her piece, defend herself, and then say she's invoking her right, not to incriminate herself, which you can't do as a matter of law.
And she said that, but she said she feared if her records were unsealed, that her testimony was unsealed, she feared for her life.
With good reason.
What does that tell us? Why would she fear for her life?
Well, because she was, attending to the rules so carefully and following the regulations and no. Anyway. Right. So, where are we then in the process with your husband? Is he just, he's going to have to serve for another 8 years? Is there any prospect that he'll be let out as Paul Manafort was let out?
We've been working every angle we can possibly work to try to get him released because, in fact, he is at high risk of the coronavirus when it hits his prison. And in fact, it just hit a couple of weeks ago, and they now have 4 cases have been identified. He had been at Fort Worth prison this time last year, and Fort Worth, the beginning of April, had no cases. And I checked today, and it's 630 some cases of the virus in the prison that Steve came from. So praise God he's not there, but it just shows how quickly that virus spread once it hit Fort Worth, and now it's in the prison where Steve is, and it's just a matter of time. He's 63 years old. He has high blood pressure, type 2 diabetic, some scarred lungs from emphysema somewhat earlier in life, and he's just the prime target for the virus. We're really, really concerned. He has other health issues as well. He filed the necessary paperwork to request transfer to home confinement. I personally wrote a handwritten letter to the warden over the complex where he is, and laid out. I addressed all of the bullets in the Attorney General's memo saying to the prisons that they should expedite transfer to home confinement of prisoners who were at high risk under the CDC guidelines, and Steve fits those criteria. And I laid all that out, and I explained we have a home, it's just me. So he would be, he has a place to come to. He has a network of friends, could undoubtedly get some work that he could do virtually and thus not be a drain on the federal system. So there's a plan. He has a plan and can transition. He's nonviolent offender, not a sex offender, first offense. All of the things that were laid out in the President and the Attorney General's memo, I addressed in my letter, and I got a letter back on this past Friday, basically bottom line saying Stephen Stockman does not qualify for home confinement.
Wow.
Steve has been given 3 different reasons in prison. He's been given 3 different reasons why he can't go to home confinement. One of them being he's safer there, and he's in a group living environment. The group living environment has like 3 prisoners to a space that was designed for 2. Let me see if I can find that. According to the USDA website, federal guidelines mandate the amount of living space that a full-grown sow must have, and it's 37.6 square feet per pig. And Steve's unit, those guys calculated that the approximate amount of space that they have per prisoner is only about 36 square feet, so a little less than the pig. But when you take away the space that's taken up by locker and the table, it leaves them about 16 square feet per prisoner. They're jammed. He's in a prison camp, and far from the image that people conjure up of prison camps being country club kind of settings with golf and whatever else, this prison's not like that. They're jammed in there, about 150 men to this large housing unit. The no-cell walls, they only have, like, he described it, it's like a huge cattle barn kind of setting with stalls. They have like chest-high walls, concrete walls, and they're basically like cattle stalls with 2 beds in each, bunk bed on one side. And he said that when they sit there, if men are sitting each on their bunk beds, their knees can touch, and so they have to wait. One man at a time can get up and get dressed to get out of there, and so they just stay in bed. It's just
what is the name of this prison, Patti?
Well, do we want to? I guess anybody can look it up on the Bureau of Prisons website. It's Beaumont, Texas. It's a Beaumont Federal Correctional Complex, and at that complex is a high security penitentiary. It's been nicknamed over the years Bloody Beaumont because prisoners murder one another in there.
Whoa.
So, oh my goodness, you've got a picture of it there. So they've got maximum security, moderate security unit, low security prison, and then there's the camp. And the camp is minimum security. It doesn't even have a fence around it, and prisoners have been known to just walk away, go off through the woods. They're quickly picked back up and sent off to a higher security prison. So there's definitely no impetus to walk away, but it's very, very minimal security. However, you don't go anywhere, and those guys furnish the labor to the rest of the complex. So they do the grounds maintenance and the building maintenance and the food preparation and all of that. So that's where he is. And now they've got 4 cases of the virus in the moderate and the low security, medium and low security units. So it's just a matter of time for that to spread. And there's no social distancing. I mean, all of us have to stay at home. I've been working from home now for how many weeks, as have most Americans. And you go out maybe to get groceries with your mask on, but there are no masks. No way to isolate themselves and protect themselves. So those that are senior, like Steve is, the at-risk people that the president tells all of us to stay home if you're a senior and take care of yourselves. These guys don't have a prayer, and it's just horrible.
Where does your governor, does your attorney general, do your senators, where do they stand on this?
I haven't approached our state legislators. I have to tell you, Steve is very much like President Trump. he went to Washington marching to his own drumbeat to do the right thing. He never went to Washington to go along and get along and do things the way they're normally done. And so, as we see with the president, those kind of folks in politics don't set well even with their own party. Now we've got a lot of friends in the Republican Party, but Steve ran. He didn't run for re-election in 2014 after he had been back in the House for a term. Instead, he ran in the primary against Senator John Cornyn.
Oh, okay.
And so he didn't ask permission to do that. And so I don't feel comfortable approaching our state officials because this is a federal prison and a federal crime. And also I've noticed that our governor tends to be, what he's saying and doing is pretty down on releasing or sending to home confinement prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I've been able to realize during going through this whole mess and finding that Republicans, his former colleagues, don't step forward. And as I said in my piece that you were talking about in American Thinker, I've really pondered that a lot, because what has happened to Congressman Steve Stockman could easily happen to any of those vocal Freedom Caucus members of Congress. And so they could easily find themselves in shackles. And so you wonder, why aren't they doing something about this? And as I've reflected on it, conservatives in politics tend to be very law and order, hang 'em high kind of people. You know, we want to see criminals pay for their crimes, but they don't remember, people are losing sight of the fact that we're seeing on full display the corruption of our Justice Department. It is not a just Justice Department. And so one would assume if you have a jury trial, as Steve assumed, once the jury heard the truth, he would be exonerated, because if the jury heard the truth, they would realize this is bogus. But what people can't mentally process it. People don't get the truth. The government has the power, and in Steve's case, the judge issued a gag order at the prosecution's request that prevented his side from talking about anything political. Even everything about this was political. I mean, the nonprofits had to do with voter education, education of people in the realm of public policy. It was all around politics, conservative politics. And so you couldn't talk about politics. And the mention of Lois Lerner's name was forbidden, just forbidden. In fact, one time, one of his prosecutors mentioned her name and was slapped down. I mean, not prosecutor, his defense attorney.
What was the reason, Patti, they gave for not being able to mention Lois Lerner?
Because they said it had nothing to do with the charges. That was that. That's my layman interpretation.
Was this the Franz Kafka courtroom in Texas? I mean, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, this is a federal courtroom, though, and for a long time, Charles, I was thinking, trying to make peace with the fact that nobody's coming forward here to speak up for Steve or try to do something about it. And I thought, well, what was my train of thought? Well, they're afraid that if they get too close to the target will be on them.
Correct.
But then he was found guilty on 23 out of 24 charges. So people think, golly, with that much smoke and found guilty on that many, there's got to be some crime there. But the dots that they're not connecting is that the feds, and Sidney's book writes about this, and there's another book called 3 Felonies a Day, and another book called Cardiac Arrest, So Many Months with blah, blah, blah. It's written by a man who suffered the same kinds of treatment Steve did, but he was counsel for a cardiac device company. So he had the money to defend himself, and he just went through attorneys. He kept burning through attorneys until he found one that would do what he knew needed to be done to defend him. And we didn't have the funds to do that. So Steve just sat there for nearly 3 weeks during his trial. They didn't allow me in the courtroom because they said they might want to call me as a witness, his team. So I wasn't there until closing arguments. But Steve just kind of sat there watching his life being sold down the river and couldn't do anything about it. He was offered the opportunity at the end to testify on his own behalf, but his attorneys counseled against it. They said, "Oh, if you do that, they're gonna have to start the whole trial again." That plus, there was not much he could say, given that he couldn't talk about anything political or mention Lois Lerner's name. So he was kind of at a loss. But that's my interpretation of why they said those things couldn't be mentioned, because they weren't applicable to the charges at hand. And the judge went along pretty much with every single thing that the prosecutors asked. The stories I could tell you about his arrest and what the prosecutors did then, and
please tell us,
and what's happened. It's just atrocious.
Well, what happened?
Oh gosh. Well, when he was arrested when he was getting on a plane. He traveled internationally a lot. That's one of his strongest interests, and he formed a lot of friendships in the Middle East and Eurasia. And so he was getting on a plane to Dubai, I think, as I recall, and they arrested him as he was getting on the plane. He was running a little late, so I think he was the last one to get on. So they captured him before he went down the jetway, and they strip searched him 3 times.
Whoa.
They sat him down and asking him questions. He said, I'm not talking to you. And they gave him some paperwork to complete. And he said, look, if you want that completed, you complete it. You know more about me than I do. You've been dogging me for years now, several years now. So you know the answers. You fill it out if you need it filled out. And so he refused to answer questions. They made a couple of snide comments, politically oriented, very snide comments as they transported him to Houston to jail for the night. And they arrested him, by the way, not on indictment, but on a federal complaint, which was fairly benign and pretty toothless. But after they had him in custody, they reconvened the grand jury and called one of his former associates as a witness who had made a plea deal. And so whatever his deal was, he testified as he had agreed to, and they then indicted Steve, I think a couple of weeks later. And so when they arrested him, he's diabetic, type 2 diabetic, and they arrested him around, I want to say, 5 o'clock in the evening. He didn't get insulin until the next afternoon.
Could die from that.
Exactly. And he told them all along, you put my insulin in the refrigerator. I need my insulin. And I'm diabetic. I can't have high carbs. So they gave him like nothing but carbs for breakfast. And he gave it away to one of the guys in the cell with him who was just thrilled. And so wherever Steve goes, I mean, he's such a likable guy. Everybody likes him except the left.
So from the arrest to his conviction and arrival in jail, how long a time period was that? Was that a year and a half? Was it?
Well, so they put him in jail overnight that night, and I thought I was happily working away the next afternoon and thought he was overseas, right? And he called. I answered the phone. It wasn't his phone number, and I answered, and he said, "Patty, this is Steve." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, I'm not in Dubai." And I said, "Okay, where are you?" Because frequently flights are diverted to different places. And he said, "I'm downtown Houston. I just got out of jail. I need you to come pick me up." He had asked them when they locked him up, he had asked, "What about my phone call?" I got a phone call, and they said, "Here, you can use," prosecutor said, "Here, you can use my phone." He said, "I'm not using your phone." And so he didn't get a phone call.
But from that day,
so they let him out on federal. Somehow there's some sort of federal system that kind of puts up your bond, something like that. And so he was released for a full year to prepare for his case. And as I said, his court-appointed attorney didn't do a thing for many months. And then the attorney that he did hire actually a friend paid the first payment of that attorney, and that's how that attorney was able to tell the judge, hey, friends of Mr. Stockman would like to pay my fees so that he can have other representation. So she agreed to the change in attorneys. And he tried to bone up, but he just really didn't immerse himself in the laws at play and wrap his arms around the innocents. It's such a big game generally between prosecutors and defense attorneys. I've been stunned that most defense attorneys recommend a plea agreement. And so everybody wins. The prosecutors get a notch in their belt. I heard Sidney talking about this in an interview a couple of years ago. Prosecutors get a notch in their belt. The defendant gets a little bit of time compared to what they would have gotten, and then they get to go free, but they're still felons, right? But when you're not guilty and you believe you'll get a fair trial, you plead not guilty. Anyway, that's what happened, and I don't know what I'm leaving out that you want to know about. But when they took him back to prison, so as soon as he was convicted, April 12th, 2018, they immediately shackled him hand and foot. I took all of his personal belongings and had to come home and get insulin and other medications, and I took it back to the marshal service there at the courthouse. And he didn't get insulin again for many, many, many hours. In fact, the next day, they let him go out in his shackles into this kind of like a dog cage area outside. He was walking out and passed out. Ooh. So the next time I heard from him, he called me a day after he had been taken off to prison, and to ask me to bring some things to the prison. I can't remember what, and that there was a nurse in the room with him, and there were a couple of officials in the room with him when he called. So I think they were letting him call because they felt so badly that, I mean, he collapsed. He passed out from, I guess, probably low sugar level. I don't know. Yeah. And so he's never had proper medication. It's just he hasn't been able to control his medication and take care of himself, and they don't do it properly. I think it's important
for people listening to appreciate that even if Steve were released today, taking a diabetic patient and putting them outside their normal care for the amount of time he already has been is having a serious impact on his health.
Yeah. Yeah. And so far, since he's been in Beaumont, he went there in August of 2019. Last August, he arrived mid-August in Beaumont. And since he's been there, one diabetic has lost his toes and his foot amputated. One died, and another had to be shipped off because I think his kidneys were so damaged they failed, and so he had to be shipped off to a more intense care facility of some sort. And so during this, Beaumont is right on the border with Louisiana, and so we get lots of rain and tornadoes and flooding in that area where he is. And then they hit the news some months ago, but I want to say maybe in October or something, a lot of flooding in that area. Freeway was closed because of flooding right near the facility. Well, during that time, Steve got insulin, I think, once, maybe not at all one day. And since the pandemic, there's been at least one day where he only got insulin once and didn't get it another day. So they're very lax. When he came to Beaumont, they reduced his insulin from 3 times a day, which is, helps control the sugar level. That's the objective with diabetes, is to try to keep sugar level as even as possible. But they reduced him from 3 doses to 3 shots of insulin a day, from 3 to 2, just, I think, for convenience of the staff, not for the health of the diabetic. And so it's just no care of the health care. I mean, there's incompetent health care.
I think it's actually deliberate sabotaging of his health. Patti, as you're speaking to us, I think a lot of people could easily listen to this and say, well, the courts are all corrupt, but it's actually much more complicated than that. You're describing lawfare, which is a very strategic attack on a target by these prosecutors, by his political opponents. We see it happening, and it's something that a lot of people weren't even aware of. It's interesting also to look at this type of attack in, through the lens of this coronavirus thing. We're presented with a condition that as lay people, whether it's a legal case or a medical case, we can't really evaluate the ins and outs of these things because there's just such a complicated array of knowledge that you need to have to even evaluate any of this. It's really upsetting, the case that you're describing. And
well, let me tell you this, Charles. When they were transferring him from Fort Worth to Beaumont, they send most prisoners, I think, through Oklahoma City. It's kind of a transfer point. So he was taken to Oklahoma City on a bus with a bunch of other inmates that were picked up along the way, apparently. Anyway, different buses arrived there about the same time. And I can't remember how many, he said, hit that unit around right in the same time frame. I'm thinking, if I remember correctly, maybe 80-ish kind of numbers of men arriving. And of them all, they called out Stockman. Stockman, get over here. Well, he had to go get his insulin, his medication. He had to go. He said, I've got to get my medication. They said, well, get it and come here. And he heard them. He heard one guard say to the other as he was approaching, this guy's got a media problem. Because there'd just been, there's a really great article on the case in the Washington Times that had just come out like the weekend before, I want to say. And they said, we know who you are. We're putting you into solitary confinement for your protection. So they put him in this little bitty solitary cell. Oh, he had gone into solitary confinement when they took him to prison from the courtroom, too, for about 3 days. And so they put him in solitary for several days. He was there, I think, about 5 or 6 days. But the last couple of days or so that he was there, at least 48 hours, they put in the solitary cell with him. And he was shocked when he saw them inserting this guy into the solitary cell with him, a guy whose nickname is Psycho.
Oh, great.
And Psycho had been in solitary confinement himself, he told Steve, for a couple of years or over 12 months, because he was such a violent, he's a murderer, a violent murderer.
Wow.
And he was so violent with prisoners and guards that they slapped him in solitary. And Steve said he was built like a brick house, and they put him in the cell with him. And Steve rolls with the punches. Steve has had some rough times in his life earlier in his adulthood. I mean, he's been through some difficult circumstances, and so he rolls with the punches and doesn't really complain, but he feared for his life when they put that guy in his prison, in his cell. And the guy, go ahead.
Any explanation given to you as to why they would put a murderer in a solitary confinement cell with a congressman?
I kind of go figure. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory to us. Well, thankfully, the guy said to him, well, I'm from a little, Steve strikes up a conversation with anybody. He said, I'm from a little town you've probably never heard of. And he named this little town, which is in our congressional district. So Steve said, I know that. I represent it. He never ever told anybody in prison that he's a former congressman. He just very incognito. Somebody would find out along the way and the word would spread quietly amongst people. But the guys in the first cell where he was he was there 7 months before he was sentenced, and they saw him on TV, on the news, at the end of his sentencing, and they were all stunned. So Steve doesn't talk about who he is, or, he's not that kind of guy. And so, but this guy, he said, I'm a former congressman. I represented your parents, your whole, that whole town. And so they were able to immediately strike a chord, form a little bond there. And by the time Steve left, it was like Daniel in the Lion's Den, frankly, Charles. Really, a Daniel in the Lion's Den story. Steve walked away, and they were friends. And Steve really had a heart for him too, because the guy's been on psychotropic medication since he was something like 8 years old.
Psycho has?
Yeah, it's just such a heartbreaking story. The guy really needs help, not clearly the kind of treatment you get in prison, but he murdered people, so he should be in prison, right? Anyway, there was no explanation given, and so I had said to Steve, and there was no contact when they're in transit. There is no contact. Steve had told me, I'll go dark. You won't hear from me until I'm arrived at whatever my new destination is. And so when he was telling the story, I said, well, maybe they did put you in there to protect you. Because he was concerned for his safety in Fort Worth. In Fort Worth, he was in there with all levels of offenders. And Steve's a legislator. He passed some of the laws that had some of these guys in prison. So he really was fearful for his life there, because we know that murders happen in prison. But this one, he said, well, they may have put me in there to protect me, but they didn't put him in there to protect me.
Right. Well, so this is, you've been very generous with your time. I mean, this is a horrific story. We watched as President Trump, I think at the instigation, wasn't it, of Kim Kardashian,
right,
changed the law to review prison sentences, to let people out early, principally minority people. But this would seem to be a case that deserves to get review on its own merits at the highest levels by somebody like Bill Barr, or maybe the president himself, or I don't know who would be in charge of this. Have you tried through Sydney to bring this case to the highest levels?
Well, let me just say that it's on his. It has been brought to him. He's aware of it, and has been aware of it for at least a year. We know that in all of this, God's in control, and somehow this is all according to His plan. And both of us have grown in our faith. We already had strong faith, but we've seen His hand at so many turns, not the least of which is Steve's experience with Psycho in that little bitty cell, and his deliverance from that. So we know that our God is in control of this, and I do not understand why He tarries. I do not understand the delay in pardoning somebody like Steve Stockman, who's cut of the same mold that Donald Trump is politically. It's kind of baffling, but God's ways are higher than our ways, and I know that it will happen in His timing. I just hope it happens. I wrote to the warden. When I wrote to the warden, I said, please send my husband home in a matter of days, so that you don't send him home to me in a body bag in a matter of weeks. And that's really the way I feel about it. His very life is in danger with this virus out there and the way it spreads when it hits these prisons. They think they're all safe and insulated there in Beaumont, because they've been fortunate enough not to have a lot of cases yet, and it didn't hit until just recently. They totally are underestimating how this thing spreads. I'm very alarmed. And again, can we just mention how your folks can help? I see that you're putting up the website and all, but
yes,
really, if people across the nation would just give a little bit, like they obviously have for Flynn, General Flynn, God bless him. But if people were aware of this, I know that they would want to help with $20, $50, $200 or $500, whatever they can afford to the Stockman Legal Defense Fund. They can give online. They can text FIGHT to 444-999, or mail checks. There's information there on the website of how you can mail a donation and help with the defense, because we didn't even go into the legal, where he is legally, Charles. I don't know if you want to take a few minutes to talk about.
Sure, please.
So he appealed. We hired an attorney who understands these laws, thank God, understands both nonprofit law and campaign finance law, and he made an incredible appeal He did an incredible filing on appeal and cited many precedents, court precedents, Supreme Court precedents, Fifth Circuit court precedences, which heard Steve's case, other circuit court precedents, in both the nonprofit law as well as the campaign finance law, where the prosecutors misconstrued the law, misapplied the law, and ignored precedents. And his attorney told me, look, only probably we have about a 12% chance that they'll even have oral arguments in our case, because in criminal cases it's just not real common. But they did have oral arguments. Before that, there was an amicus brief of, I think it was 23 co-signers on an amicus brief filed in Steve's appeal. Extremely well written. The documents are available on the website if people want to look at them under appeal filings or something like that, it says. Excellent amicus brief. And when the government responded to our appeal, they cited the amicus brief something like 13 times, as well as answering our appellate document. And so the author of the amicus brief said, look, they cited me 13 times. I want to respond. So he wrote a request to the court asking for permission to file an amicus response as well. And Steve's attorney told me, Patti, he said, to say that they'll accept this amicus brief is a slim possibility, is an exaggeration. But sure enough, the court responded, yes, they could file the amicus. So there were a second amicus brief was filed in the appeal, and then they heard the case. And so I went to New Orleans for the appeal, and it took the court a while. We had a 3-judge panel, 2 Obama-appointed judges, and 1 Reagan-appointed judge. And surely that Reagan-appointed judge must have 1 foot in the grave by now. In fact, he didn't make the hearing in person. He participated by phone, I guess like the Supreme Court's doing right now with what things they're hearing. So anyway, he never said boo. He never said, hi, I'm here, I'm sorry I couldn't be there, or anything like that. But they assured us that he would have access to the recording of the hearing and all of the filings, just like they did. So anyway, that judge wrote the opinion, and the judge that wasn't there wrote the opinion, and they ruled against every single argument we had made. I was shocked because they were so well substantiated with precedent, and they ignored their own precedents and their own Fifth Circuit precedents and said that they weren't applicable. It's just mind-boggling. So the next step you can take is Steve had his attorney file a petition the court to hear his appeal en banc, E-N-B-A-N-C, which means the full court. Right. I think there are 15 or 16 judges on the Fifth Circuit. And so we were asking that the full court hear the appeal. And again, it was amazing filing. It's just so well documented, so well justified. And again, the amicus author authored another amicus brief and had far more. It was like nearly 60, if I'm not mistaken, or nearly 50 co-signers on that amicus brief. People, former legislators, attorneys that represent nonprofits, other people with nonprofit interests or campaign finance interests, folks that had a stake in these decisions signed on. And if your viewers and your listeners look at those, they'll know the names of people that signed on to these amicus briefs. And then Eagle Forum Education and Legal Defense Fund also filed an amicus brief in our petition for an en banc hearing, and it took them only about a month. And the response was just this little form, and it had an X checked that said the 3-judge panel recommends not hearing, and no member of the court called for. Basically, they didn't call for a vote of all of the judges as to whether or not they would hear it. Not one member called for a vote of the court of whether or not they would hear this en banc. And I'm still I'm just speechless. I can't believe that these incredible filings, either the judges didn't read them or they just don't care. Steve's attorney told me, well, Patti, the Fifth Circuit is known to be a conservative court, and by conservative, they mean hard on crime. And he said, it's if you've got a criminal conviction, it's next to impossible to get any satisfaction out of the Fifth Circuit. So, wow. So our only option available now is to appeal to the Supreme Court and hope that there are some rulings, particularly the fact that they're ignoring precedents, that maybe they will want to have a look at this case. So the fee that's necessary to go to the Supreme Court is more than we can afford, but the filing is due in July.
Wow, very
so
soon.
We've got to raise some substantial funds, and like I said, internet shows like yours just don't have the audience that Hannity or Tucker Carlson or Rush Limbaugh have, where the patriots nationwide rise up and help with this kind of thing. So anything you guys can do.
Yeah, Patti, I certainly hope that our viewers, and we've got almost 1,000 people watching the show right now. I agree with you. It's not quite the reach of a major show, but people can go to defendapatriot.com. That is the website that you can help defend Steve Stockman. You can make a contribution. Any amount will help, but this is truly a travesty of justice. And I think that your appearance on our show, Patti, it's very timely because we've obviously heard this phone call of Barack Obama saying that actually questioning the FBI's methods of entrapping someone into making statements and coercing them into making statements in court, that nobody's coerced them. Somebody had an interesting comment. They coerce you into a plea deal and then coerce you into saying nobody coerced you to accepting this deal. But everything that you've described is this kind of lockstep method where the lawyers, the prosecutors, I mean, look, let's face it, most lawyers, they don't care about what happens. And even if they do care, they've been through this system so many times that I think a lot of them recognize that they're working on a sort of a statistical analysis of all their clients, and they figure, you know what, if I spend all this time on Steve Stockman, these 5 other people are going to have a bad outcome. It's a similar challenge that doctors have. People really need to be their own advocates when it comes to their health, their freedom. You really need to educate yourself as to what's going on in these courts. I mean, you're describing multiple things that I talk about all the time on Crowdsource the Truth. Lawfare, social engineering. Yeah. We've seen a lot of articles. What do you know about this courthouse news service? Have you seen this website before?
No, I haven't.
It's interesting to me because there are things about it that cause me to be reminded of websites that publish information about me. And of course, the uninitiated come to a website like this and it looks like news. And so if you read a lot of news that is not favorable about Steve Stockman,
that's right,
and you don't know anything about him, this is going to sway public opinion. Even the people who appear in the courtroom, if they're in the jury, if you're a judge, if you're a lawyer, everybody's affected by this news.
You know, to that point, Charles, the judge, Steve told me the judge even made a comment when I don't know if it was during the trial or pre-trial or when, but the jury was not in the room. It was just both sides of counsel. And the judge made the statement, I don't watch the news. I just read the Chronicle, the Houston Chronicle. Well, the Houston Chronicle, since Steve first threw his hat in the political ring in 1990, has done nothing but trash Steve Stockman and make up all kinds of falsehoods. I mean, print just flat out lies. And we tend to just blow it off because it's just Houston paper. But this judge gets her news from the Chronicle, and his sentencing attorney, we hired a sentencing attorney from Dallas to come and try to get a lighter sentence for him. And by the way, she looked at a university study that showed that public corruption cases, the average sentence for public corruption cases was 23 months. 23 months. And this judge gave Steve 10 years. But anyway, after the hearing, she said to me, did you see the way the judge, did you see the hatred in the judge's face as she was basically lecturing Steve before sentencing him? And I said, I wasn't close enough. I couldn't see her face. She said, I have been doing this for, I think she said, over 20 years. She said, I have never seen such hatred spew out of a judge in my life. She said that at least 3 times right after the hearing. She was astonished. And one of the other attorneys said, she doesn't like Steve. And so I don't know if it's because she gets her news from the Houston Chronicle, like she said, and to your point that you're making, I don't know, but I do know that people have gone out and they've surfed the internet, and internet search tools bury conservative stories. So if people want to see all the conservative press, the truthful press that Steve has had, it's on our website.
That's great. Well, I think another thing I would say to you is that I'm actually distantly related to the Bush family, and I don't like them. And we could get into that at another moment. But I think one of the additional reasons that Steve may have gotten into trouble in Houston and in Texas is that Steve's attack against Whitewater strikes very close to the Bush skeletons in the closet, which only got worse after Bill left and expanded illegally his presidential foundation into activities involving first George H.W. Bush in the Tsunami Relief Fund, which was a complete fraud, and then the Bush-Katrina effort, which is another fraud, and then the Clinton-Bush-Haiti was yet another fraud. So I think, unfortunately, what may have happened here is that it suited the never-Trump Republicans and the Obama people to come together and just make an example of your husband.
Well, in fact, the guy over the Justice Department here in Houston was brand newly appointed. In fact, he's the son of Dan Patrick, our attorney general, our state official, Dan Patrick. This is his son, and he made the statement, let this serve as an example to other corrupt politicians. So there you go. And so let me just make a couple of other points. One is that Steve tried to have his attorney go after what's the evidence where they hide it? They don't give it up. Exculpatory evidence, yeah. So he asked his attorney to file a motion for exculpatory evidence, like Sidney did, and he refused to file a motion. Instead, he wrote a letter to the prosecutors, which is not a legal filing. And they basically responded and said, we're not going to give you anything unless you can give us some legal reason that we should.
The legal reason is they're mandated to do it as prosecutors.
So an attorney that was kind of supporting Steve provided them with the legal terminology to give them back.
I would caution you, Patti. I don't know that attorney is supporting him, because you see, I'm starting to hear a pattern here. When there's somebody that they want to go to jail, there's things that can be done to make sure that it happens. And any attorney that doesn't fight vigorously for this Brady material, this exculpatory material, is failing to jealously defend their client. And you should file a bar complaint against the attorney who didn't provide it. I mean, I'm sorry, I can't give you any legal advice. This is my opinion.
Well, those kind of actions can't be taken until after we've exhausted all the other legal channels.
Okay.
Right. Forget I said that. I can't give legal advice, but it is.
But anyway, so that was one thing I wanted to mention. And the other is I wanted to tie it to the whole Flynn thing. So the exculpatory evidence, we're convinced must be there. And should be sought, but I don't know if it's too late in the game to seek it, given where we are. The other point I want to make is that earlier on I had thought, in fact, some of my earlier editorials that you can find published, I talked about how this really is the deep state. It's deep. deep. These guys are deep. You don't know their names, the prosecutors' names. But Steve has pointed out to me on more than one occasion, you don't think that prosecutors, even deep down in, came after a sitting congressman without the top of the agency knowing about it,
Right.
do you?
Right.
Which are the same people that we're seeing at play with Flynn. Well, and it would have been Eric Holder, under whose watch it started. Hello, Steve signed on to a bill to impeach him.
Well, I think we refer, and I know Jason has this visual out there, we refer to Rod Rosenstein, who was the Deputy Attorney General, I believe by the time your husband was indicted. And we refer to him as Rat Rodenstein. I think he is dirty as hell. And, so this miscarriage, apparent miscarriage of justice occurred under the Trump administration, when Rat Rodenstein was a Deputy Attorney General and James Comey was still running, dopey James Comey was still running the FBI. It's continued. It's continuing. But it was
Obama's people.
Right. But my point is that, here you have, if you think about Flynn for a second, you have a war hero, an Obama appointee, a Democrat who challenged the all-knowing Saint Obama on his disastrous Middle East policy, and I think his challenges were absolutely correct, who challenged the narrative that we should fear Russia and that instead felt that we should fear China. For that, they take a general, a war hero, and they destroy him. In your case, they take a congressperson and family, and they destroy him. Think what the next generation of unscrupulous leaders can do to ordinary Americans. They did this to a general, they did this to a congressperson. Each of these prosecutions, I would argue, are malicious, partisan, illegal, political prosecutions that I remember as a child. I'm 64, and I remember, there was no prospect of ever going to Eastern Europe or beating the Soviet Union. I just assumed there'd be a portion of the world that would be locked down, Communist China would be locked down. And the tales that you're describing, the tale that Flynn lived through, is a tale that you would read about in a Franz Kafka novel or, in East Germany when there was the Stasi. This
That's right.
Absolutely, this whole story needs to get the widest possible hearing. We only have a few minutes left, Patti. We'll love to have you back on to figure out what happens as time passes here. But really, I'd really encourage our viewership to share this podcast around with your friends. We will certainly tweet it out. We have some ideas offline, Patti. We can get you to other interviews if you're interested.
Sure.
But this injustice must not stand, and people behind it must pay very heavy prices. And more to the point, the charity fraudsters, the Clintons, the Obamas, the Bushes, who've been using presidential charities to do heinous crimes, in the case of the Clintons, to distribute adulterated HIV/AIDS medicine around the world that has killed people. Those charities don't get investigated, but this one apparently did at light speed, right?
Little bitty charities, little charities that were in good standing with the IRS. But if all 1,000 of your viewers that are watching now just gave $10, that would be $10,000. A big down payment on the first filing with the Supreme Court, whether or not they would listen, would hear the case as a long shot. But
one thing to be clear to the viewership for a second, Patti, is that this is an appeal for a legal defense trust, which is not a charity. This is non-tax deductible stuff. So I want to make very clear that
that's right.
What we're doing right now is, Patti, we're asking the viewership of Crowdsource the Truth, as you've suggested, if they could, $10 or whatever anybody can manage. We know people are in a difficult financial situation themselves, but this is an important matter, not just for Steve Stockman's freedom, but this is a pattern that's got to be stopped. And the people who are behind this, enabling it, these judges, these attorneys, they cannot be allowed to continue in this manner, because this is exactly why our country is in the state that it's in right now. We're all under house arrest, except for the people who could be, like Steve Stockman, who is under illegal arrest, where he's being tortured and subjected to the slow deterioration of his health. Everything about what you've told us, everything about this situation, even if Steve were guilty, which I'm not suggesting that he is, this is so far beyond the pale, so far into the territory of cruel and unusual punishment. I'd like to take us back to a point that Charles made at the beginning, because we are almost out of time, but we started by speaking about Whitewater, and we were talking about, what was the guy's name, Charles?
James
McDougal?
James McDougal, rather. Yeah.
So James McDougal, very interestingly, I just learned today, died at the age of 57 in jail in Fort Worth.
And Clinton pardoned his wife.
Right.
Bill Clinton pardoned Susan McDougal.
That's right. That's right.
So it's very curious to me when these key witnesses die. It's another thing. James McDougal's lawyer died shortly after this. They were both under 60 years of age. So, I mean...
And Jim McDougal, for the record, and your husband will know this, he knew where the bodies were buried. Jim McDougal was not a banker by training. He was not a financier. He didn't understand land development. And Bill Clinton, he went to Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was making roughly $26,500 a year and had no cash, had campaign debts, and said, "Hey, Bill, I'll let you into this land deal here. You're the Attorney General, you know. That's why don't you take $11,000 and put it into this land?" He didn't have $11,000. And then he got into the campaign for governor with Bill, and 2 years later, Bill was the governor of Arkansas. McDougal was made in charge of economic development for Arkansas, and all the cronies around that got Bill Clinton elected knew that, you know, you want something out of the governor, buy a land lot, you know, funnel cash to Hillary at the Rose Law Firm, do whatever you want. And McDougal knew all of that. Indeed, they had a falling out. In 1994, McDougal went and tried to sell the remaining records that he had, and he did sell them, and he threatened the Clintons. And sure enough, you know, he goes to prison, and he dies in prison. And this is not...
It was unclear what effect his death would have on the probe, Charles, but today it seems quite clear that it ended it.
Right.
It's interesting how people associated with the Clintons die, including die in prison. And really, we have feared for Steve's life.
Well, let's hope he stays safe and protected, and that there are good angels watching out for him. Let's hope that there is some sense of this broadcast and other broadcasts like it, and your great work, your writing, touches the hearts of people who can make a difference in this matter. Because this is not America. These are not our values, as Barack Obama said, right?
No.
These are not American values to do this to this congressman.
Yeah.
No, in fact, he was everything. He was everything that conservative Americans want in a congressman. They want people that have backbone. And colleagues of his on both sides of the aisles would say to him, "Stockman, you better be careful. Stockman, you better be careful." And Steve said, "I didn't come to Washington to be careful."
Right.
And that's why they're careful. That's why we don't see more. That's why we don't see more action out of Congress. They're being careful.
Well, please keep us informed, and we'd love to have you back on, and maybe a couple months from now, and we'll see what actually happened and between now and then. We'll send you our best. Thanks for all your hard work.
Well, and before we end the broadcast, I do want to draw people's attention just one more time to defendapatriot.com. People should definitely visit the website, read all about Steve Stockman's case, but most importantly, even if you can only manage $1, if you donate, if you're watching now, forward this to friends, let them know about this travesty of justice. I really think it's very important that we help the Stockman family not only get Steve back to freedom and safety, but to shine a light on this corruption. This is something that can affect all of us. It's very close to me because we've seen how abuse of the legal system can really affect people's lives. I've been fortunate enough to not have it impact my health and not become a criminal matter. But there are really wrong-headed people who want to abuse the legal system. And when those people get into positions of power, we're all in trouble. So it's important that we stop this right now. Patti, thank you so much for joining us. Really, we send the best to Steve and you, and hopefully he can be out soon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. Thanks a lot.
Our great pleasure.
Bless you and your audience.
And thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Have a great day.